I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome. Welcome to the first in our series, Celebrate America 250 on Liberty. I am Judy DeAngelis, small president of the League of Women Voters of the Space Coast. The League is a nonpartisan political organization. Our mission is to defend democracy and empower voters. We encourage informed and active participation in government. The League works to increase understanding of major public policy issues through education and advocacy. To celebrate our country's 250th birthday, the League and the Brevard County Library System are partnering together on this series given our joint mission of disseminating knowledge to all. In this anniversary year, we're focusing on improving civic knowledge. Our goal is to remind ourselves of our founding documents and the ideals they contain. The framers were not all of one mind, either on the extent of separation from England or on how the government of the new country should look after independence when they drafted the Articles of Confederation and later the Constitution. But they all agreed that they loved America and wanted the best for its people. Although they disagreed on how to arrive at a more perfect union and who should comprise it, it's a good point to remember today, and the League and the library system are excited to provide this forum for civil discussion of our four concepts from our foundational documents: liberty, democracy, separation of powers, and equality and civil rights, and how they have evolved to this present day. And now, I would like to introduce the Planning Committee Chairman and our moderator today, Lori Albee.
Thank you, Judy. Appreciate that. So our program today will be in three parts. So first we're going to have a Thank you. First, we're going to have a presentation by Dr. Terri Fine on the concepts of liberty. Then we're going to have a brief interview portion where we're going to take those concepts and apply them to some current day issues. And then finally, it'll be open to you for questions. The League does questions in written format. That's why you all have a 3x5 card and a pencil on your chairs. So write down the questions, hold them up, and one of the League members wearing one of the purple or blue shirts will come and pick it up. A lot of times we get duplicate questions, so someone else's question might be answered asked instead of yours. If you don't think your question was answered, please feel free to ask another question. We want to keep this a very involved and engaging dialogue. So now I would like to introduce our speaker. At the end, the conclusion, before I do that, obviously we have refreshments. Help yourself to refreshments at any time. At the back table, you'll find a survey. We'd like you to fill out the survey and tell us how we can improve this event. And there's also a copy of some resources about liberty and our foundational documents, milestone documents. So please feel free to take those as well. There's a couple other freebies over there. Feel free to take. So without further ado, Dr. Terri Fine taught courses focused on American politics and political psychology at the University of Central Florida for 34 years prior to her retirement in 2023, receiving numerous teaching and university awards. She developed the course Political Ideals and the U.S. Constitution based on a course she taught for the Florida Prison Education Program and established the UFC Civics Teaching Certificate, the first of its kind in Florida. From From 2008 to 2023, she served as content specialist for the USC-based Florida Joint Center for Citizenship and as associate director of the Lou Fry Institute of Politics and Government. She's also been active in many other professional endeavors, serving as civics consultant to the State of Florida Task Force on Holocaust Education, as well as a featured educator in the Orange County Regional History Center's Kahila, a History of Jewish Life in Orlando exhibit. A full copy of her bio is also available on our table in the back. So without further ado, please, Dr. Fine.
Thank you, Lori. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much, and thank you. I'm very surprised and happy. I think someone took my presentation. Thank you, Lori. That's fine. I'm very surprised and happy to see all of you today. It's a beautiful day, and here in Brevard County, as Lori said, I did retire in 2023, and my husband Paul, who is here, we now live in Boynton Beach, so we are very happy to be here in Florida and to have so many opportunities, whether they be in Orlando, here in Brevard County, down in South Florida. We've had all kinds of opportunities to celebrate the Declaration of Independence and its 250th anniversary. I will be sad when this anniversary year is over. It's been a wonderful opportunity to really talk about ideas and the way that these ideas are experienced today. I'm also on a clock here, so let me just set myself up. Oops. Okay. So if you've been to one celebratory anniversary, we have 3 chairs up front if anybody needs. If you've been to one celebration about the Declaration of Independence, it probably started with the idea that the Declaration of Independence includes in it 4 promises. And those 4 promises are included in the preamble to the Declaration, and then after that, it's a series of evidence statements about how those promises have been violated and haven't been kept, and also how the failure to fulfill the promises justifies a right to revolution, which is to alter or abolish the form of government that was in place. So one of those 4 promises is actually 3, we'll call them sub-promises: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and these are unalienable rights. Now, being unalienable means that these are rights that a person is born with, and the second promise then is the rights that people are born with, and liberty is one of those. So what this means is that when the decision was made to declare independence, that decision included the idea that a person's rights with which they are born were being deprived them by the government. 11 years later, the preamble of the U.S. Constitution includes several purposes of government. One of those is to secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. So first, liberty is denied them. That's in 1776. And then in 1787, 11 years later, one of the purposes of government is to secure the blessings of liberty. So it should come as no surprise to us that liberty not only is important, but it also is the first subject of this series of lectures that are being sponsored by the League of Women Voters. So while the promise of liberty is declared and the goal to protect liberty is included in the Constitution, it's important to have further clarification on why it was that this right was not added or included in the Constitution until after the original Constitution was ratified. So I often look at the Constitution in 3 parts. One is the original 7 articles of the Constitution. That was
adopted in 1787. It was formally ratified in 1788, which then enabled the election of the first president, George Washington. But one of the reasons that there was a lot of conflict, in fact, the central reason about the conflict, about whether or not the Constitution should be ratified, had to do with what you and I now call the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the US Constitution. Why was this a problem? What was the issue? Well, in many respects, the issue was liberty. Because you and I can say, well, I know that liberty means freedom, but you and I also know that if everyone had as much freedom as they individually wanted, we would all not be able to come to a forum such as this. We would be unable to come. We're going to leave it that way. So the debate came up as whether or not should the Bill of Rights be included in the Constitution that was then going to be examined by the 13 state legislatures and part of the original, and back and forth and back and forth. And James Madison, one of the authors of the Declaration of Independence, he would later become President of the United States, number 4, he said, how about if we promise to add the Bill of Rights later, and that way, if we could vote on the first 7 articles. And still, right, Article 7 of the Constitution requires that 9 of the 13 state legislatures approve or ratify the Constitution, and it took as long as it took to have a baby. It took 9 months. It took 9 months for those first 9 states to ratify the US Constitution. And it took Rhode Island until 1791, several years later, to say that they would agree to abide by the Constitution. And a lot of this debate focused on liberty, whether or not we as a nation should specify the liberties that people would have. After all, liberty is inalienable and the government should secure it. What should those freedoms be? What are the extent of those freedoms? So that was very central to the debate. Now we know that the Bill of Rights was eventually ratified, but it wasn't ratified until after Rhode Island said that it would join this new experiment that we call the Constitution, and then the Bill of Rights was proposed, the Bill of Rights was ratified and added. And then I consider the third part of the Constitution to be all the amendments that came after that, because every single one of those addressed an issue that was sort of in the public mind at the time. But the Bill of Rights were collectively the first 10, and they were part of the debate relating to the ratification of the Constitution. So what were some of those freedoms? Well, we often focus on the freedoms included in the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, and the Fifth Amendment. Those are very central. So the First Amendment, one sometimes says that there are 6 freedoms in the First Amendment. I say there are 5, but there are 6 protections. So there are 6 protections, 5 of which are freedoms. So we think of freedom of speech, freedom of peaceable assembly, etc. But one of those, in fact, the first one, and the first word of the First Amendment is Congress shall make no law. Congress shall make no law establishing a religion. Is that a freedom? To me, no, it's a protection. But it is part of the 2 components of the First Amendment that guarantee what many people say is freedom of religion. It's a very common phrase for people to say, the First Amendment protects the freedom of religion. And I would disagree with that. The First Amendment protects against the establishment of religion. The First Amendment protects the free exercise of religion, but that more general statement, freedom of religion, is not listed in that First Amendment. The right to peaceable assembly, the right to petition the government for redress of grievances, etc. The Second Amendment is actually in 2 parts, but one of them that matters to us today is the right of the people to keep and bear arms. So that's also a liberty and a freedom. And then when we talk about the Fifth Amendment, we're talking about the idea that a person is going to have their freedom unless the government can come up with reasons to deprive them of that freedom. That is what we often refer to as due process. Now, the Fifth Amendment due process clause only applies to the federal government, which is where I get into the last amendment that's important for focusing on freedom, and that is the 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868 in the aftermath of the Civil War. And that is the amendment that includes a state-level due process guarantee as well as equal protection. So all well and good, and I'm sure that many of you say, I know this already, why is she telling me this? Because we know this, but we might not know why. It is important, for example, for us to understand that the Declaration of Independence did not form a government. It focuses on values of liberty, but there are substantial disagreements about what those limits should be. Consider, for example, George Washington's farewell address. George Washington was the first president, and thus he was the first president to make the unprecedented decision to leave office after 2 successful terms. This set the precedent for the 2-term presidency until, of course, Franklin Roosevelt, and then Franklin Roosevelt became the only president to serve more than 2 terms, and then the Constitution was amended to prevent more than 2 terms in the future. President Washington said, I will carry the Constitution. He said, I will carry it, but he meant the Constitution with me to my grave, that your union and brotherly affection may be perpetual, that the free Constitution, which is your work, which is the work of your hands, may be sacredly maintained, that its administration in every department may be stamped with wisdom and virtue. So here we have that George Washington, he's the person who was president when the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution. He was a person who was on the side of including of not including the Bill of Rights in the U.S. Constitution at first, and then adding it later, etc., and that all worked out. But ultimately, it was important to President Washington that by keeping the document, the Constitution, and the rights included in it and added to it later, sacred, that the government would be able to fulfill its responsibility to protect unalienable rights. But what inspired all of this? That's really very important, because the writings of the philosophers that we focus so much attention on when it comes to guarantees of liberty were people who were not writing at the time of the Declaration of Independence. In fact, when we look at Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau, 2 of those 3 passed away before 1776, and they all lived under a monarchical system. So when we read Locke and Rousseau and Hobbes, we're focusing on their ideas. Their ideas were reflected in the Declaration, and the ideas of the Declaration were then used to create the government structure of the original Constitution. So the one that we're most familiar with is John Locke. John Locke believed in equal rights to life, liberty, property, and work. He believed that human beings were born in a state of perfect freedom. They were free to act however they wanted, as long as they were not violating the laws of nature. So when we're talking about the laws of nature, It's the laws that allow people to act freely because we're born free, as long as my acting freely doesn't restrict another's right to also act freely. So many of us have heard the more contemporary phrase, right, my freedom ends at the tip of your nose, meaning that I am free to punch as long as I don't deprive you of your freedom to go about walking around and being safe from my punches. Very important concept. Because what happens is that people then get into debates about how far it goes that you and I can be denied our freedom for the sake of other people enjoying their freedom. That's where we bring in this concept of the public interest. So when we're talking about laws and regulations that are meant to frame and enforce natural rights, we're often talking about the concept of being in a state of nature and abiding by the law of nature. Being in a state of nature means that a person is absolutely free. We are born absolutely free. But when there's any limitation put on that freedom for the sake of the public interest, for the sake of a civil and safe society, then we're talking about living in the law of nature. And many of the political debates that were going on in the 1770s and the 1870s and the 1970s and today have to do with at what point is the public interest going to infer or interfere or take away from my rights that I was born with? What is the government looking to take away from me for the sake of the greater good? And there is a lot of disagreement about what that should be. At the same time, there's this argument that when an individual joins a community, they consent to forfeit at least part of their freedom. Now, under what system are we all born where we are free, but we're also born into a government system? Our families, and that's something that John Locke talked about. That even though we're born free, we are born into a family. And as we grow and develop, we are learning about rules and expectations of our behavior. We're learning about punishments for failing to fulfill those expectations. And that's where Locke said, this is not foreign to people. This is not something that people would not understand, that we can be free and governed because people are born free and governed in a family setting. Locke also believed that if a ruler abuses their power, then the community should have the power to choose a different ruler, or, as we know, several years after his passing, or to walk away from that ruler. Obviously, not literally, because we were already an ocean away. But many people argue that this is somewhat theoretical, because sometimes, especially like in our system today and in many countries elect their leaders, and the only people who can then win an election are people who ran. So it's not as if we could say, well, we're gonna change this leader to a better leader. We're changing this leader to a leader who is among our options in this particular election or in this particular case. Locke also argued about the idea that liberty cannot exist without equality. And interestingly, the very first of the four promises of the Declaration of Independence is all men are created equal. Therefore, and they are born with these unalienable rights. So what this means is that every single person, by virtue of being born, by virtue of being created, they then are equal to every other person, and thus liberty cannot exist without equality, because taking away somebody's liberty is also denying them that other promise of equality. Now we're going to talk about the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau focused on this concept of the social contract, wherein the government's legitimacy comes from the consent of the governed. Now that's the third promise in the Declaration, but he saw this as being central to fulfilling unalienable rights. That if the government is going to limit liberty, it must have the legitimacy of the people to do it. Or as Rousseau once said, man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. Why? Because once you're born, you're governed. Born into a family, born into any kind of a family setting, you are being governed and therefore you are chained the minute that you're born. Rousseau's ideas provided the justification for the shift from a monarchy to a self-governing republic. Now, in the preamble of the Declaration, it says that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends meaning goals in this context, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. So Hobbes is the only person who actually lived to see the Declaration of Independence. He lived till 1778. Locke had passed away, and then earlier than Locke and Rousseau was Thomas Hobbes, and he's going to be the last philosopher we talk about, and then we're going to move into some contemporary discussion. Hobbes is best known for saying that life is nasty, brutish, and short. Okay? And that is, the reason is that if we can be abused by government, too many of our freedoms can be taken away, but if we demand too much freedom, then we will not have the protection that a government could provide. He believed that nobody is powerful enough to be immune to attack, and because even the weakest person can kill the strongest if there's nobody around to stop them. So what he was suggesting is that there needs to be a strong government element. We shouldn't wait to see that the government abuses its power to the point that we revolt. We should assume that there needs to be this public interest protected. So even though Hobbes believed in everybody having equality, he also suggested that we had the equal power to kill each other. So it's good to keep and killing each other is not just physical, but it also can be based on an element of mistrust. In other words, our communities might not be as strong as they could be if we mistrust each other. So we, in essence, can kill each other with our isolation from each other. So, with all of that said, these three philosophers who lived under monarchical rule, only one of whom lived to live during the period of the Declaration of Independence. It's their ideas that were so central to the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and then many of the amendments that came after. So now we're going to come to a more contemporary set of examples, taking these ideas and looking at the Constitution, etc. And in many respects, it's why we are here today. We are here today thanks to the League of Women Voters of Brevard County. Why did the League of Women Voters form over 100 years ago? They formed over 100 years ago because women were given the right to vote by the U.S. Constitution, and thus no state could take it away. Please understand that when we're talking about freedom, and we might have this discussion in a little bit, part of that freedom is how much freedom do the states have to decide how their residents are going to be governed compared to the federal government. Well, by by the 19th Amendment being ratified, that took power away from the states to deny women the right to vote. Now, why did it take until 1920 for all of this to happen? In many respects, it was because of the idea that while women were considered to be equal, they were also considered to be meaningfully different, that they should not be participating in what we know as civil society. So that doesn't mean that women were not citizens. It doesn't mean that after citizenship was defined, that doesn't mean that women were unable to function in society, that they lacked freedom. Rather, they were a separate group, and it was groups like the American Women's Suffrage Association and other organizations that fought for women's suffrage to justify that women should have equal power to decide who governs them. Because before then, there was this long history going back to English common law of what many people refer to as coverture. The idea was that men were better suited to decide what was best for women, so men covered the interests of women with their own civic behavior and civic activity. So after women were granted the right to vote in 1920, there were these reasons linked to gender roles, etc. So why did the League form? The League formed to educate women about their newly established rights and protection to vote. And for many years after, from 1920, and political scientists say probably until 1980, but until that time, for about 60 years, women's voter turnout was significantly lower than men's voter turnout. Why? Because of this belief system that more women had, and that changed, that shifted, that lowered over time, that men were they were dominating government, they're the ones that should run the government and participate in government, etc. So even when women did have that liberty to vote, a smaller percentage used that right to vote compared with men. What changed in 1980? What changed was public opinion. There were, for the most part, public opinion as a sort of a statistical science, we might call it, really came into play really in the 1930s. So going back to the 1930s, when we looked at political opinions between men and women, they were largely the same. And so a lot of women, because of their perspectives on gender roles, would say, well, yes, I have the freedom to vote, but I don't need to because perhaps I'm being discouraged in my home or something like that. And there are these people from the League of Women Voters who keep telling me to vote and telling me why, and I'm gonna stay home. But the issue positions on a lot of issues were basically the same. But then in 1980, issue positions changed, and they changed on an issue relating to women's liberty. And in the 1980 presidential election, there were significant differences in the positions taken on women's liberty and reproductive autonomy. Different positions taken between the Republican candidate and the Democratic candidate. So that's why in 1980, we see turnout up and a gap. So a much larger percentage of women than men voted for incumbent President Carter, and a much larger percentage of men compared to women voted for the former governor of California, Ronald Reagan. So the reason that I bring up that case study is because I wanted to point out that one of the motivations for this organization and one of the motivations for women to turn out to vote and then started voting at the same rates as men had to do with their perceptions of liberty. Why? Because there are differences of opinion about to what extent should reproductive rights and liberties extend to the point where, at what point is the public interest going to need to be protected to place a limitation on women's reproductive rights and opportunities? And is there another, remember what we said earlier about Locke and Hobbes, was this idea that a person has has the same liberty as everyone else, there's equality. And so then questions emerged about what are the issues relating to equality as they pertain to men and women, and what is the extent of those liberties. What also happened in the late 1970s was that President Carter brought back the draft, because it wasn't a draft, but selective service registration became a requirement. Gender differences, questions about what are the issues that relate to treating men and women differently when it comes to policy making and policy decisions. So what we see is that there was these important differences as they relate to gender issues. The last example I'm going to give, or the second example, is going to be relating to the issues of the First Amendment, and that is about religious freedom. As I mentioned when I opened my remarks, I said that the First Amendment includes that Congress shall make no law limiting establishing a religion, and people are guaranteed the free exercise of religion. But there's been significant debates, particularly since Lyndon Johnson was a senator in the 1950s, about what is the extent of freedom of speech based on what people can say in their houses of worship. Because Senator Johnson added an amendment to the tax code in terms of that houses of worship could not endorse candidates, but they could take positions on issues. And then in 2017, President Trump, he signed an executive order adding clarity to the Johnson Amendment. And in essence, what he said was that if it turns out that the discussion of these issues might include talking about specific candidates for public office, then that is going to be an acceptable reflection of the Johnson Amendment, and then would be consistent with the First Amendment free exercise clause. So in any case, we have all kinds of contemporary issues, whether they relate to First Amendment issues, Second Amendment issues, due process issues, equal protection issues, that ultimately get to how much liberty is acceptable, and at what point do we focus on the public interest to rein in the exercise of that liberty. I look forward to your questions, and I look forward to my discussion with Lori. Thank you so much.
Sign here, let's,
Oh, I'm sorry.
it's all good.
It says university.
Yep, we have it.
I might have turned it off.
Okay, so in the Declaration of Independence, there were, of course, lots of debates. So there were a lot of debates in drafting the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson, who was one of the lead drafters, created kind of a conflict within the Declaration itself, because he talked about, and we know he was in favor of states' rights and state sovereignty, and he was, of course, a white planter, but he also made the statement, all men are created equal. That's resonated down through history with some people trying to say state sovereignty on this side versus this universal concept of liberty. So could you discuss a little bit of that in the context of the debate and where it leads us?
Sure. Thank you so much. So in my remarks, I talked about that one of the freedom issues was the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment says that all the powers that are specifically given to the national government, it says Congress, but we mean the national government, stay with the national government, but it must be the word it uses is delegated. All other powers, if it's not federal, it belongs to the states. And what many scholars argue is that amendment was included in the Bill of Rights. It's really giving rights to the states, not rights to individuals. That amendment was included in order to sort of address some of these concerns. However, what's in the Constitution and who wasn't in the United States when the Constitution was being debated? If you've seen Hamilton, you know the answer. It's Thomas Jefferson. And that is that the Article 1 of the 7 Articles, Section 8, Clause 18, says that the first 17 clauses are what the national government can do. Establish post offices and post roads, declare war, etc. But the 18th clause says that Congress shall have the power to do everything that is necessary and proper to fulfill these other obligations, these other requirements. So what has happened since the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution is the debate about whether or not the states are being denied their reserved powers under the 10th Amendment with a specific policy, or is this a proper exercise of Congress using its power under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, the necessary and proper clause? So in terms of Jefferson's concerns had a lot to do with representation, right? If you have more power at the state level, then the people who are serving in state government are going to be closer to the people. They will have a better understanding about what their constituents want and need, and they will also be more sensitive to the culture of the place that they are representing. So we see these states' rights versus supremacy of the national government issue continue since Jefferson, and certainly the Supreme Court has been looking at many of these issues on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you. I'm going to skip and then we'll open it up to everybody. So, in 303 Creative LLC versus Ellenis in 2023, the U.S. Supreme Court examined whether Colorado's anti-discrimination law could require a web designer to create websites for same-sex weddings, an act the designer stated would violate her religious beliefs. The Supreme Court ruled 6-3 in favor of the designer, finding that the First Amendment protects her from being forced to create expressive content that conveys a message she opposes. Could you discuss this in the context of freedom from and freedom to, please?
Sure. Okay, so Lori and I met before today. Lori is excellent. And so in our meeting talking about this session today, Lori met me actually in West Palm Beach, so she was in my backyard, now I'm in hers. And basically, what we talked about was this idea that a lot of the debates about freedom are not about freedom in a generic sense, but really about whether or not a person has the freedom to do something, to act in a particular way, or are they protected? Do they have freedom from government or other people requiring or expecting that they do things that they are not required, that they should not be required to do? So here we have in this particular case that a same-sex couple is arguing that because that their civil rights are being denied them, that they would have the exact same rights as a couple who's male and female, that they would be allowed something that they were being denied, that the same-sex couple was being denied, and whether or not a person in an owner of a private business can be required to exercise, can be required to not provide these messages that this same-sex couple was asking her to do. So thus we have the debate. We're not talking about government here. We're not talking about a government policy, right? We're talking about a private business. And in essence, the same-sex couple was arguing that they were being deprived their freedom to have what the business transacted that they would otherwise have the freedom to have. But the business owner was saying that she was being deprived of her freedom from engaging in business in a way that she did not support due to her religious beliefs. What's kind of interesting, I'm going to just add a comment here. What's kind of interesting is if we should look at this in the context of the late Supreme Court Chief Justice, William Rehnquist. William Rehnquist, one of the arguments that he made in a case that I didn't have a chance to discuss, but if you ask a question about it, I might do it then. He basically said that religious freedom can be understood through thought, meaning that it may well be that for the sake of the public interest, that a person's religious practices can be limited, but that doesn't mean that they're being denied religious exercise. They can have thought. In other words, they can experience their religious exercise through their thinking, but we can regulate their doing if it violates the public interest. So that was a very interesting perspective as it applies to this case. Because here's somebody who the Supreme Court decided that indeed that this person had rights, that this person could not only deny themselves business, but there might be other circumstances that had nothing relating to religion that could also somehow be justified. So when I was reading Lori's question, I was thinking about William Rehnquist and how even though he was very much in support of religious liberty, he said that there are going to be some circumstances where that religious liberty is going to be, we have to be thinking about if the action, if it was not in a religious context, what would that look like? So in the Supreme Court siding with the business owner, in essence what they were saying was that there might be other contexts in which the person could say that they would not accept business under certain circumstances, and thus it was consistent it was not inconsistent with religious freedom. Go back to the podium. Okay. But I won't move the podium again. Get back in the saddle.
I got it.
So, and I want to compliment you because Lori was supposed to ask me 4 questions, but you have so many questions that we cut Lori off for your sake. So good job. Yay, you. Okay.
I'll just talk loud. Hopefully you can hear me.
and I'll repeat it.
Okay. Please discuss how talk of liberty at this time period sparked enslaved people escaping slavery and an early start to the women's suffrage moments.
Okay, so we're talking about how a desire for liberty sparked people seeking to escape enslavement. Okay, so please discuss how talk of liberty, I think at the time period of the Declaration or at the framing of the Constitution. Well, that in many respects reflects sort of Locke's viewpoint that everybody is born free. Our granddaughter just turned 2 last Monday, and she is perfect. But I will say, right, what's the adjective that we use when we talk about 2-year-olds?
Terrible.
The terrible twos. In other words, here's somebody who was born free and doesn't understand why there are all these rules now about bath and picking up toys and all those things. So the question itself was not a humorous question, so we're going to get serious now. So in essence, what Locke and Rousseau and Hobbes, what they were talking about was that this desire for freedom is in our soul. It's innate to us. And when the systems around us, when we come to understand as adults that when we come to understand as adults that we are being denied that freedom, then we will take great risks. We will take great risks to ourselves, to our families, to our friends, and to our loved ones in order to seek out that freedom. And so even though the slave holders did not see enslaved people as entitled to equality and liberty, that doesn't mean that the enslaved people did not have those beliefs in their souls, and it motivated many to seek escape. As well, for the women's suffrage movement, the questions emerged about if women had political or government power, what would that mean in terms of having other kinds of power? Because the women's suffrage movement wasn't the only thing that women were fighting for at the time, which was the right to vote. There were women who, a famous case from the 1800s where a woman who had attended law school was not allowed to become a member of the bar only because she was female. So there were all kinds of different arguments about how holding power means that policies can be changed. Okay, thank you. Was there a time limit placed on the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment? If so, why? Well, the answer is yes and yes. The amendment process, that's Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution. The Constitution does not provide for a time frame for amending and adding an amendment to the Constitution, but it is typical that when Congress, which has proposed every amendment that became an amendment, if that makes sense. Over 11,000 amendments have been proposed, but 26 of the 27 have been proposed by Congress. So vast majority were successful when they started in Congress, and then Congress would set a time frame, and the average or typical has been 7 years. So when the Equal Rights Amendment was first proposed by Congress in 1972, a 7-year deadline was put on it, but then in 1978, Vice President Walter Mondale saw the handwriting on the wall, in that he didn't believe that 38 states would ratify by the 1979 deadline. So he then convinced Congress to extend the ERA deadline for 3 years, so that it would be a 10-year total deadline. And then during that time is when President Carter brought back selective service, and so the ERA became a lot less popular because there were so many concerns about whether or not women could be called up because of selective service, whether or not they could be called up for selective service if the ERA was ratified. So the one, if you're itching, the one amendment that was not proposed by Congress was the rescission of prohibition. That was the only one. What are the powers and responsibilities of citizens to protect liberty when democracy is under attack? Well, the First Amendment, use your First Amendment rights, right? That we have it's very hard today to find an issue where we have universal agreement. And that means that one person's concept of democracy being under attack is another person's concept of democracy functioning beautifully. And it's the same issue. People are looking at the same issue. So the key is to use those rights that are protected and enshrined in the First Amendment relating to the right to speak, the right to peaceable assembly, the right to petition the government, and the right to freedom of the press. So it's a matter of people using those rights that are protected and then also taking action if those by challenging if those rights are being violated. Okay, what questions? Florida is trying to pass a law allowing families to opt out of vaccines for children attending public schools. Doesn't this affect the freedom of all those attending public schools? Well, there's a few answers to that. There's one answer that has multiple parts. Okay, one of the things I want to make clear, if I've been following the news as I think I have been, is that the recommendation for that law is coming through the executive branch. And what that means is specifically through the Secretary of Health. I don't know if that's the name of that person, but it's Health and Human Services at the national level, and I believe it's Health also here in Florida. So here we have a sort of a recommendation from a person who is recognized as an authority on health issues, a person who's been confirmed through the process, through the process of the Florida Constitution. One of the issues that people have had is that the public interest is being threatened by eliminating a vaccine mandate. Now there are today options available, right? If a person says that we have a concern, we have a religious exemption, that's one option that people have. People have the option if they are not comfortable with whatever the policy is at the time relating to vaccines, there might be schools for their children to attend or homeschool that might be more in line with their opinion, whatever their opinion is, for or against, but whatever their opinion is. So what many people argue about situations that are being described in this question is that when it comes to public schools, because they are taxpayer funded, should be more cognizant of this concept of the public interest. In other words, there should be more effort taken to reflect the viewpoint of the majority, whether it's a majority of people in the community, the majority of families sending their kids to school, etc. And so even though those options exist, there are many people who say, yes, but when it comes to public schools, there needs to be sort of a different standard about the public interest. And consequently, there's a lot of debate about vaccines. Now, there are others who suggest that if a person, adult or child, is vaccinated, then what is the impact on them if there's an unvaccinated person attending school, whether as another student or a teacher, administrator, etc. So in terms of affecting the freedom, there are many people who make the argument that the freedom to not vaccinate has sort of its basis in the libertarian principles of the state and federal constitution. So it's an interesting discussion. Yes? I'm good, thank you. There is a significant disagreement over the meaning of the current Constitution. And based on the second question, this person is asking about the federal Constitution. Should the United States replace its 200-plus-year-old Constitution? I'm going to rephrase that question. Should citizens of the United States try to replace its 200-year-old Constitution? Why is that important? Revision, not because it's a perfectly written question. Because if we go back to the Bill of Rights and to all the 27 amendments to the Constitution, we have to look at look at things as we've done the same as we would if we went to Las Vegas or Atlantic City. 11,000 proposals to amend the U.S. Constitution have been put forward in some form or fashion. 27 of those have been successful. Who wants to bet that replacing the Constitution, because it would be technically an amendment, would actually happen? Well, this is where, and we didn't have a chance to talk about this in our discussion, but this is where the talk of the courts becomes important. The U.S. Constitution does not include what we know to be judicial review. But wait a second. The Supreme Court can decide what's constitutional. Isn't that in the Constitution? No, it is not. Okay, in 1803, the U.S. Supreme Court made what many people argue was its most impactful and important decision, and that decision was that it was the U.S. Supreme Court that could decide whether a law cohered to the U.S. Constitution, and since that time, of course, we look at executive orders. I reviewed an executive order for you at the end of my remarks. But the Constitution hasn't been changed to limit the amount of time that justices serve on the Supreme Court, even though they took this power for themselves in 1803. So my sort of reading the room, so to speak, in a large context, is that it's not that people are upset by the Constitution. They love the Constitution, but they don't love how 9 people are interpreting the Constitution using a power that the Constitution doesn't give them. That's what I'm hearing, right? That if people believe that the Supreme Court was making decisions that they supported, whatever those decisions are, I'm not taking a position on any decision, but rather it's the concept that the rest of the Constitution, right, except for Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution, every single person holding public office either is elected or is appointed by an elected official and then confirmed by an elected body. And thus, there are these ongoing, we call them in education assessments. There's an ongoing assessment process. If you think the person's doing good at their job, you continue to re-elect them if they've asked you for that. If you think that they're not, you might vote for their opponent or not vote at all or run yourself or whatever the case may be. But one of the issues that's come up is some people have said, well, maybe instead of changing the whole Constitution, maybe what we should do is to establish term limits for the Supreme Court. Because in their view then, there would not be the politicization of all these other factors that relate to serving on the Supreme Court, because people on both sides and all sides sometimes disagree with Supreme Court decision making, and yet justices are appointed for life, and that process for appointing justices for life came before the Supreme Court decided it had the power to decide what the Constitution means. Certainly there are other issues here that certainly warrant our discussion, but I don't want to monopolize on this one excellent question. Yes?
These two are related, but I don't know if you want to read them together or separately.
That's a great idea. Oh, well, interestingly, it follows from the last answer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It says LA, I'm going to read one and then the other. LA and Texas are displaying the 10 Commandments in public schools. Isn't this a violation of religious freedom? The other question is, how does or should religion play into determining liberties as many shape the state laws of nature, the law of nature, based on their religious beliefs? Well, for some people, the argument about whether it's the 10 Commandments or religion shaping policy discussions, there are arguments to be made that this government decision, like say posting the 10 Commandments, would then need to be evaluated and looked at by the courts. Similarly, if there are policies being made that relate to religious beliefs, again, there are electoral processes for people to either to demonstrate their approval or disapproval of those kinds of decisions. So whether or not this is a violation of religious freedom, what some courts have said is that because the recognition of the 10 Commandments and the recognition of the expectations of individual behavior that are included in the 10 Commandments, because so many of those are congruent with so many laws in place, right? Thou shalt not kill. That's in the 10 Commandments, but it's also enshrined in law. They say that it's objectionable to a minority of people, and for that reason, it's not violating a freedom of religion as much as it's reflecting the viewpoints of a majority of the community. So it's a very interesting issue. I remember when I was at UCF, that President John Hitt, who was there for quite a long time, 1992 until I think 2018, it was there a long time. One of the things he required was that the American flag be hung in every single classroom. And there were many people who objected to this. There were some professors who said, I'm a Canadian citizen. I don't think I should have to look at an American flag in my classroom every day. And the president's response was that this reflects the values that we want students to engage with. We want students to uphold certain viewpoints that are sort of represented by the flag. And so I can sort of if I had tea leaves, I could sort of say, well, that perhaps might be the basis for a decision about the 10 Commandments, that it's sort of a majoritarian reflection of majoritarian viewpoints, and therefore it might be acceptable as a reflection on most of society. That's a big pile over there.
That's your last one.
Okay, this is my last one. Are you sure?
Well, these were duplicates.
Oh, okay. Okay. Why is the dollar given the same rights as citizens where billionaires have more rights than other citizens? So the summary from my partner here, Lori, was that this is about Citizens United. Let me, by the way, the Supreme Court decision in Citizens United was 5-4, so it was a very divided decision. But let me sort of explain to you what the issues are or are in that case that made it, that I was surprised it was 5-4. I thought it would be more lopsided in favor of Citizens United, to be honest with you. Because Citizens United was about a group spending money on behalf of their political perspective. Citizens United was not about giving money to any candidate for public office. It never was. It is about what in the federal campaign law is considered, it's considered an independent expenditure. Independent does not mean independence of viewpoint, like you can't be partisan and then you, no. It's independent of the laws and independent of the actions that relate to a person or a corporation giving money to a candidate. Rather, independent expenditures have to do with giving money to radio stations and advertising agencies and so forth in order to produce materials that are then used to present that corporation's point of view. Justice Scalia, Justice Antonin Scalia, who passed away about 10 years ago, he basically said, and you can please look it up online, it's not an exact quote, but he said basically, if we're talking about free speech, are we offended by the speech or the speaker? Interesting. Is it because what these corporations are saying offends me? Or is it because it's being said at all? And so the opinion itself, the 5 people who voted in favor of Citizens United took that position. So, which is that if it's free speech, then it's free speech. It's not who's saying it, it's free speech. And that is because there are sort of 2 related reasons to why there's so much opposition to the decision. One of the reasons has to do with if a person, one of the arguments is that, well, wait a second, if I'm a customer of this company or if I'm an employee of this company, I then get linked to that point of view that I don't have, right? So if X company is, buying advertising time in favor of this or against that candidate or what have you, and I'm employed by that company, then there's sort of this position that I must, if I'm part of my company, then I take that position. And so that's sort of one of the bigger arguments against it. And the other, of course, is that corporations, of course, have a lot more resources available than individuals. And so that's where a lot of opposition to this decision is the outsized opportunity that corporations have to engage in independent expenditures. And certainly, even though there's a difference between what they call hard money and soft money and so forth, certainly you and I are not as concerned about saying, well, does it matter if they bought money to put, this case was about a film that Citizens United wanted to broadcast. It was called Hillary the Movie, and it was an anti-Hillary Clinton film. She was seeking the nomination, this is from 2008, she was seeking the nomination, and Barack Obama, US Senator Barack Obama was prevailed in that situation, and Senator Clinton did not. So, former Senator Clinton at that point, no, she was a senator at the time. No, I'm sorry. She left the Senate to run for president, so she had been a senator, but not at the time of the case. So, I think that a lot of these issues come with sort of, is my government going to listen to me, you know, one person, are they going to listen to my point of view if they have somebody else spending on my behalf have an outsized impact? So, it's not that billionaires have more rights than other citizens, but the way that the decision was, the reasoning in the decision is the idea of having the same rights, and that's in the First Amendment. Okay, so Lori, are we gonna, oh, okay, sorry.
Well, thank you so
Hold
much.
Give this to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Fine. And thanks very much for everybody attending our first of a series. I'd like to first thank Dr. Fine for an excellent and engaging presentation. As a small token. Oh.
I didn't say it was a light token.
Small, heavy. As a small token, we'd like to give you this.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. I'd also like to thank our partners at the Brevard County Library System, Director Wendy Bost and Assistant Director Griselda Clark. Let's give them a hand. Our League of Women Voters of the Space Coast Planning Committee also worked very hard to bring this event to you today. So thanks to Diane Conaway. Susan Little up front here. Ina Fritz. I don't know where Ina is. There we go. Okay, Ina. And Gina Lindhorst in the back. And of course our chairperson, Lori Alvarez. Thank you so much. Before you leave us today, please fill out our survey to let us know your thoughts on today's event. You can help us to improve each of our final 3 sessions coming up. Democracy will be the topic in July, separation of powers in August, and equality and civil rights in October. There is a flyer at the back table. You may take one to remind yourself of the upcoming events. Our League of Women Voters of the Space Coast table has various brochures and handouts. Please be sure to take a look back there. There's a handout on Vote 411 is a website that is very user-friendly to actually see a personalized ballot. You just put in your town or county, and actually put in your city even, and it will show the amendments particularly to your city. And it's a really great website the League has created. So visit that website. The site also provides voters, well, I already said that, never mind. Also, any amendment information, you know, sometimes they're particular to the city or the county. We have a handout of important dates regarding the election, when you need to do things, you know, like get your mail-in vote ballot in and the primary dates and the general election dates. They are back there. You can fill out a paper form at the circulation desk of any library in Brevard County for registration. Again, thank you so much for coming, and make sure you fill out that survey for us.